Since we've been asking questions today, let's ask three more. The first question would be, why do we resist suffering so much? The second question, is suffering going to be a part of our lives? And third question, what are we supposed to do in the suffering? Let's start with number one. Why is it that you and I resist suffering so much? I think it's real natural for our world to resist suffering. I think it's a part of human nature. However, I have to admit that I live in a world of immediate satisfaction. I think so many of us, and perhaps even in your own life, can see the gadgets and gizmos that we are surrounded with that give us instant information and immediate satisfaction. And suffering obviously is a deprivation of the type of satisfaction that you and I are surrounded by. So because we are trained to be and need to be satisfied, it's easy for us to resist suffering. Number two, is suffering going to be a part of all of our lives? Yes. Where evil is, where sin is, suffering is. And as those two things are going to be a part of our lives, we have to admit that suffering is going to be a part of our lives. Now, most importantly, what are we supposed to do in the midst of the suffering? Well, the tendency is for us to run or to medicate. Either we want to run away from the suffering, or we want to choose things in our life that will help us forget about the suffering, to medicate the suffering. And usually those choices lead us into greater sin, which only intensifies our suffering, even in a different way. I think a lot of times when we don't know what to do in the suffering, it's because we're out of control. And when we're out of control, we want something that we can control. Either we want an answer, so we ask why, hoping that the answer gives us something that we can wrap our minds around, and then we can move on. Or we want somebody to blame. So it's quick for us to blame other people, or what I've seen often in my life is we blame God in the midst of the suffering, because in both of those circumstances we're out of control. We don't know what to do in the midst of the suffering. Well, if we can believe that God is with us in all things, especially in suffering, then we can let Him in. What I've learned a long time ago is that suffering can actually elicit in our hearts the questions about life, the deeper things about life. Our search for God can actually be sometimes intensified in the midst of the suffering. And if we can go to God with those questions, with that desire, we can find that He's with us in a very relational way. I've often been told, I've often heard people say, well, just give that to God. Just give your suffering to God. And I think that there's a trap in that, because we want to get rid of the suffering. We want to give it to God so that we can go back to our worlds of ease or pleasure. Now, there's a difference between giving it to God versus giving God permission to come in to our lives, to come into the suffering, to be with us in the suffering. And that's what teaches us about redemptive suffering. What is redemptive suffering? Well, suffering has been redeemed on the cross by our Savior Jesus Christ. As He entered into all things, including suffering, and brought forth the victory on the cross, He redeemed the world and He redeemed suffering. So when you and I allow our suffering to be joined to His, when we stay in communion with God, as our hearts stay with God in the midst of suffering, then we can join our suffering to His suffering, and we can experience our suffering redeemed by His redemption on the cross for all of us. To be with Him and to let Him be with us in the midst of the suffering. I'm reminded of a good friend of mine, Father Larry Gillick. He's a great spiritual director in the Omaha community. And Father Larry, who's blind, tells a great story about being on vacation one day, walking around in a neighborhood, one that he's very familiar with, and just the circumstances of the day, he gets kind of turned around and gets lost. So he begins to pray, and he hears God say, sit down in the middle of the street. Kind of an odd thing for God to say, so he spits back at God like, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. To which God responds, put yourself in a position to be found. So Father Larry trusts the Lord in the midst of being lost. He sits down in the middle of the street, and eventually he hears a car coming around the corner. And the good news is that the car stops. They actually recognize Father Larry, and he gets in their car, and as they're laughing their way back to the house, Father Larry exits, and as he opens up the front door, he realizes that he just learned the most important thing about the spiritual life. that there will be moments in our life where you and I feel lost, scared, and we don't know where to go. The most important thing for us to do is to put ourselves in a position to be found. God is pursuing us. God is calling us. Catechism says that God is tirelessly pursuing every one of us. No matter what it looks like in your life, in your home, at school, in the quiet recesses of your own heart. No matter where your suffering is, put yourself in a position to be found. Let God find you. Let Him be with you. And let the Lord love us even in the midst of our suffering.